There have been a lot of interesting sessions here today, but the one that really caught my eye was on prevention, which isn't something that we've talked about a lot yet. But with rising numbers, even with that drop in incidence that we've been talking about, the prevalence is still enormous. We really need to think about prevention. So I have with me two people who were at that session, Jason Gill, who was the chair of the session, and Jonathan Valabhji, who is, what is your title at NHS?
At NHS England, I'm the National Clinical Director for Diabetes and Obesity. In my clinical role, I'm a diabetologist at Imperial.
So he's a very important person. Jason, let's start with you. Tell us a bit about some of the themes that came up this morning.
Yes, the session was about prediction of type 2 diabetes and prevention. So the first few talks were all about metabolomics, proteomics, genomics, trying to see whether you could predict diabetes by knowing more about these. So there's some quite complicated techniques. They seem to predict risk. I think that the challenge is whether they predict risk better than the things we already measure. We measure BMI, we measure glucose, and these predict risk and family history. These predict risk pretty well. And the question is whether in clinical practice these will give you something which is extra, which will work beyond what we already know.
And presumably would add expense at a time when you need to extend testing.
Yes, I think that is going to be a challenge. I mean, they tell you about mechanism. Mechanism is very important. There was one talk on follistatin, which will help us understand a lot about the biology of risk of type 2 diabetes, so that's really important. I think the open question is whether measuring these extra things, which are expensive, is actually ever going to come into clinical practice. And I think that's an open question at the moment. If costs come down hugely, then maybe they will, but I think that they're expensive, and I think we can predict risk reasonably well from simple measures that we already routinely take.
And in the UK, we have our genomic medicine service just about to kick off, so you never know, costs may come down. Jonathan, let me turn to you, because you were presenting a study that you've been involved in prevention. Tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. It's not really a study, it's an evaluation of a live service that we've implemented in England. We've achieved universal coverage across the country quite recently, about 12 months ago. So this is taking people already identified to be at high risk by the standard risk engine, determining who has a blood test, and if your blood test is in the what we call non-diabetic hypoglycemic range, but many others would describe it as the pre-diabetes range, then those are the individuals who we want to target these interventions towards. It's not rocket science, it reproduces as best we can the cardinal sort of behavioural change interventions that were described in the original randomised controlled trials in America and Finland, etc., that focus on weight loss, more physical activity and better quality nutrition. We have scaled up. We're delivering around 100,000 interventions per year now across the country, with the opportunity over the next few years to double that up to 200,000 per year. I think if one can describe it that way, there is a huge market for diabetes across the world. We're not far off 500 million people now. And so I think you made the point earlier that there's big investment in research and development, which is often focused on the treatment. But of course, if we're going to be considering the sustainability of our health systems, and our National Health Services in England is typical of all, in that we have to consider the sustainability and the costs moving forward, then we need a sharper focus on prevention, and that's what this is all about. We are taking people at high risk, doing what the NHS does well. It takes people and does stuff to individuals, in this case high-risk individuals who don't yet have a disease, in the hope that we can prevent or delay onset of that disease in the future. It's complemented by population-level approaches as well. Many might be familiar with the sugar tax that was recently introduced in the UK. So I think we've got two different approaches for prevention. We do have some population level approaches. That would be a cardinal example of a fiscal measure. But what we do in the NHS is do things to individuals. So we're covering that base in terms of prevention.
And if you were meeting another diabetologist from a different country, what would you say were the key learning points from the work that's done in the UK? I mean, for instance, there's a kind of carrot, isn't there, for the people that are for providers. and there are other incentives for people who are enrolling those in the programs. What has really worked in this program?
I think the key features are that we've managed to implement a program at scale. I think in terms of countries that have established universal coverage with a type 2 diabetes prevention program, I think the data that I published today is probably the biggest data set that is out there. We've learnt a lot. We've learnt a lot from other countries that have preceded us. Some of the fantastic work that has come out of the United States Diabetes Prevention Program, the Finnish Diabetes Prevention Program, and also Australia have done a live implementation of prevention, have been very useful. I think engagement is crucial. Retaining people on program is useful. I think one of the advantages is that we have delivery by non-healthcare professionals, and one of the challenges facing all of us, I think, across the planet is availability of healthcare professionals and the numbers that one has. And I really didn't want to develop a scenario where people were resigning off the local intensive care unit to deliver our diabetes prevention program, but it's delivered by lay people, and that's a major advantage. The providers of our intervention are required to collect lovely data, so we've got really complete data on our participants, which is fantastic and allows us to do the sort of evaluation that I presented today. I presented data on the weight loss trajectories and the reductions in HbA1c today. So the acquisition of data as part of what is essentially a service that we deliver to people has been a real advantage. In terms of the payment system, in a way, it does selectively encourage our providers of the interventions to ensure people are retained on program, and we were able to show a lovely dose-response relationship. So the more sessions people attend, the more weight loss they achieve, actually. And so there's a system of payment at milestones, which has been very, very helpful. But I think for a universal healthcare system where care is free at the point of delivery for all, it's given us a marvellous opportunity to really drill down and examine the demographic determinants of uptake. And we've seen lovely uptake, actually. This wasn't data I presented today. We published this about 18 months ago. We've had as many, if not slightly more, from the most deprived quintile compared to the least deprived quintile. In terms of Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups in England, that's about 13% of the population in our first year of activity. About 26% of attendees were from those ethnic groups, and we know that they carry a much higher risk of development of type 2 diabetes. So I think the approach has thrown up some really important messages. In terms of what I presented today, some of the retention data shows that that's not necessarily reflected in who stays on right all the way through and to the end of the program, but we're developing methods by which we can improve that. So, and one of the things we'll do, one of the big messages is that we're not engaging young people quite as well, but we've done some pilot data which we published, pilot studying which we published recently to suggest that some of our digital modes of delivery are selectively and much more successfully engaging younger individuals.
Let me ask Jason what you thought of all of this, because there was a suggestion that there was weight loss, but there wasn't really a corresponding reduction, a big reduction in HbA1c. What did you make of that?
So those are average changes in HbA1c. If you looked at people who got to the end of the program, they actually got quite a big change in HbA1c, about 3 or 4 millimoles per mole. And if you take that at a population level, it's probably going to have an effect on diabetes risk. I think for me, what's really interesting, I was saying to Jonathan earlier, is what to do for the people that don't engage and the people who do drop out. What can we do to them, and be creative about ways to get them engaged? Because those are if we can only get a fraction of the population, we will reduce their risk. And it's a question about what we can do for everyone else. And I think that's going to be the big challenge over the next decade.
The key may be then not what we do to them, but what we can do with them. Because I think sometimes if you co-produce these things, that actually people with diabetes really have some good ideas about the kind of things that they'd like to get involved in. And I think sometimes we're a bit top-down about prescribing what people...
I think there was code design in the model. I think one of the things that came out was... in non-white groups, retention seemed to be a little bit less good, and it's trying to understand a little bit more about what we can do for particularly South Asians who are at very high risk of diabetes, and what we can do with interventions to work better in them, maybe. I don't know.
And there was a very interesting suggestion from an audience member that actually in the South Asian population it's delivered by non-professionals, and that actually the professional approach is an important cultural aspect in South Asian populations.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes a lot more expensive if you get sort of doctors to try and deliver. So there would be some economic modelling needs to be done, because I don't think you could deliver it for £250 a person if you had doctors delivering it.
But there are a lot of doctors retiring early from the NHS. But it's been I'm so glad that I got you to come here, because prevention is hugely important and needs far greater focus. But I'm also very glad that, Jonathan, you brought up that point about healthcare professionals, because we will need 80 million healthcare professionals in order to bring all the world up to even basic levels of healthcare. So everything we do has to be considered in the light of we will not have that workforce in the numbers that we need. So we have to think about other ways to deliver.
I completely agree, and that's sat behind the model that we've developed, actually. As I say, it's not developed by healthcare, it's not delivered by healthcare professionals, which I think is important. I think the co-production point that you raise is a really important one. We've done something perhaps somewhat unique in that we've had a triumvirate of organisations implementing the programme. So not just the NHS in England, but Public Health England, and also our major third sector diabetes organisation, Diabetes UK, have been at the table with us. So 3 different organisations, and Diabetes UK have been fantastic in terms of engaging the people who will potentially be using these interventions. So I'd like to think that very much has been an effort at co-production.
Jason, final word from you, because you were chairing the session today. What have you taken, and what's your key message that you would like other diabetologists to know from the session that you chaired?
Well, I think it's that prevention can be done at scale, and we hope it's going to work. I mean, the early indicators are it's going to work. We need to follow it up for several years to find out what's the effect on sort of diabetes incidence and complications. But I think what Jonathan and the English Diabetes Prevention Programme shows that you can actually sort of translate these things into practice. And I think there has in the past been a quite big implementation gap between sort of doing the research and doing the trials and getting it into practice and actually changing people's lives. And this is a really good example of how you can actually make that final step. So I await the results over the next few years with great interest.
There you are, that's a message for all diabetologists watching. Get it out there at scale. Prevention can work. Thank you so much for listening.